In 2016, a judge looked across a courtroom and said something that should have been impossible. Christian Laettner, the only college player ever selected for the original Dream Team, owed $14 million to 5 different creditors. His $4 million mansion had already been seized. His wife had filed for divorce. And the men trying to force him into bankruptcy weren't strangers. They were professional athletes, people who had trusted him with their career's savings. On the surface, this looks like another broke athlete story. A man who had everything, then didn't. But here's what that framing misses entirely. Christian Laettner didn't lose his money gambling. He didn't lose it on cars, or jewelry, or bad habits. He lost it building something real. Something that still stands today in Durham, North Carolina, worth $187 million with someone else's name on the deed. That's not a cautionary tale about excess. That's a tragedy about ambition. And the darkest part? The people he hurt most weren't his enemies. They were his teammates. Angola, New York is not a place that produces legends. It's a small town near Buffalo, close to the Canadian border, where winters are brutal and expectations are modest. George Laettner worked as a newspaper press plant printer. His parents had immigrated from Poland and spoke English as a second language. His wife Bonnie taught school. They were a working-class Catholic family who went to church on Sundays, paid their bills on time, and didn't have much left over. This is important, because for the next 30 years, the entire narrative around Christian Laettner would be built on one assumption: that he was privileged. That the arrogance, the confidence, the way he carried himself, it all came from money. From a life where nothing was ever hard. None of that was true. When Laettner earned a scholarship to the Nichols School, a private prep school in Buffalo, his family couldn't fully cover the costs. So he worked. He cleaned hallways. He mopped floors. He did the jobs the wealthy kids at Nichols never had to think about. And then he walked into those same classrooms, sat next to those same kids, and outworked every single one of them on the basketball court. He also worked on a farm. Not as a hobby, as income. The boy who would one day be called the most hated player in college basketball history was, at 14, doing manual labor to stay in school. That detail matters. Not because it makes what came later forgivable, but because it tells you something essential about how Laettner was wired. He didn't come from a world where things were handed to him. He came from a world where you fought for every inch, and where stopping, under any circumstances, was not an option. That mentality would take him further than almost anyone in the history of college basketball. It would also, eventually, consume everything around him. Duke University, 1988. Coach Mike Krzyzewski had been building something in Durham, North Carolina, a program that was becoming a dynasty, but hadn't yet won a championship. Into that environment walked an 18-year-old freshman from Angola who was physically gifted, intellectually sharp, and constitutionally incapable of backing down from anyone. What followed over the next 4 years is almost statistically incomprehensible. 4 consecutive Final Fours, 2 national championships, an NCAA tournament record that still stands today, and a moment in the 1992 East Regional Final against Kentucky that became the single most replayed play in college basketball history. The setup: Duke trailing by 1 point, 2.1 seconds on the clock. Grant Hill throwing a full-court pass. Laettner catching it at the top of the key. 1 dribble, a turn, an 18-foot turnaround jumper. Perfect. 10 for 10 from the field that game. 10 for 10 from the free throw line. 31 points with 0 misses. But here's what people remember just as clearly as the shot itself. Earlier in that same game, Laettner had stepped on the chest of Kentucky's Aminu Timberlake, a player lying on the floor. It earned him a technical foul. By every right, it should have earned him an ejection. The referees let him stay, and he hit the shot that broke Kentucky's heart. The hatred that followed was immediate and, for many people, permanent. But examine that moment without the emotion. A player who should have been ejected wasn't, won the game anyway. It didn't feel fair. It didn't look fair. And in college basketball, where fans attach their identities to their teams in ways that are almost tribal, not fair is the deepest wound you can inflict. Laettner didn't create the hatred. The hatred was a logical response to watching a guy who played on the edge physically, emotionally, competitively, and kept getting rewarded for it. That reputation would follow him for the rest of his life. Even when he deserved better. Even when he didn't. Then came the summer of 1992, and the decision that crystallized everything. The selection committee for the first ever Olympic Dream Team had a choice to make. The roster was filled with the greatest NBA players alive: Michael Jordan, Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, Charles Barkley, Patrick Ewing, Scottie Pippen. There was one remaining spot, and instead of selecting Isaiah Thomas, instead of selecting the college player most people expected, they selected Christian Laettner, the only amateur, the only player without an NBA contract. He replaced Shaquille O'Neal, who had just been drafted first overall. The reaction from the NBA establishment was immediate. He didn't belong there. He was a college kid standing next to gods. Jordan reportedly made his life difficult in practice. The message from some veterans was clear: you haven't earned this. Laettner played anyway. Averaged 4.8 points per game on a team that won gold by 43.8 points per game. Did his job. Stood his ground. Got his gold medal. And that pattern, being placed in environments where he was told he didn't belong, then refusing to leave, defined him completely. At Nicholls, he was the scholarship kid who outplayed the rich ones. At Duke, he was the freshman who started on Final Four teams. On the Dream Team, he was the college kid who looked Michael Jordan in the eye. He always found a way to survive, to compete, to win. The tragedy is that he took that same mentality into business, into real estate, into financial deals involving tens of millions of dollars and the life savings of people who called him a friend. And in that world, the refusal to lose doesn't build championships, it builds lawsuits. By 1995, Christian Laettner had everything the world said he should want: an NBA contract with the Minnesota Timberwolves, a recognizable name, a gold medal, a legacy built on 2 national championships, and the most famous shot in college basketball history. For most people, that would have been enough. Build the career, collect the checks, retire comfortably somewhere warm. Laettner wasn't built for enough. He called Brian Davis. Davis was Laettner's Duke teammate, his roommate, his closest friend in basketball. Where Laettner was the star, the face, the villain, the lightning rod, Davis was quieter, sharper in the boardroom than on the court. He had played briefly in the NBA, but understood early that his future wasn't in the game. It was in what came after. Together with Tom Neiman, a Duke Business School graduate with real development experience, they formed Blue Devil Ventures. The idea was straightforward, at least on paper. Take the abandoned tobacco warehouses rotting in downtown Durham, North Carolina, and turn them into something people actually wanted to live and work in. Durham in the mid-1990s was not a desirable address. The tobacco industry had collapsed. The warehouses were empty. The downtown was struggling. Most developers looked at those buildings and saw liability. Laettner and Davis looked at them and saw opportunity. They weren't wrong. Using historical tax credits, HUD funding, and private investment, Blue Devil Ventures converted 5 old tobacco warehouses into what became known as West Village 241 residential units, 36,000 square feet of commercial space, restaurants, offices, the kind of mixed-use development that urban planners dream about. It anchored a revival that transformed downtown Durham into one of the most desirable neighborhoods in the Research Triangle. West Village Phase 1 was, by any honest measure, a genuine success. The buildings filled up, the commercial spaces leased, the neighborhood came alive. Here were two former Duke basketball players doing something that most athletes never attempt, building something tangible, something that employed people, something that improved a city. The local press celebrated them. Durham embraced them. The story was clean and inspiring. But even in the middle of that success, the first cracks were forming. Not in the buildings, in the relationships. Success in real estate requires patience. It requires managing investors carefully, communicating clearly, delivering on timelines. These are not the same skills that win basketball games. On the court, Laettner had spent his entire life operating in 2-minute drills, fourth-quarter moments, 2.1-second windows. The decision is immediate. The result is immediate. You win or you lose right now. Real estate doesn't work that way. Money goes in. Years pass. Returns are slow, conditional, dependent on markets and interest rates and municipal approvals and 100 variables that have nothing to do with how hard you compete. Laettner understood ambition. What he was still learning, slowly, expensively, was the difference between vision and execution. By 2005, the vision expanded dramatically. West Village Phase 1 had worked. So Davis and Laettner decided to double down. In December of that year, Blue Devil Ventures purchased 7 additional buildings in Durham, a $160 million project that would extend the West Village concept further, transforming more of the old industrial district into the kind of living, breathing urban neighborhood that cities across America were desperately trying to create. The numbers were staggering. The ambition was real. The capital requirements were enormous. To fill that gap, they started raising money. And because Laettner's name still carried weight, because he was still one of the most recognizable figures in college basketball history, people listened. Professional athletes listened. Former colleagues listened. People who had watched him hit impossible shots in impossible moments and decided that if anyone could pull off something this ambitious, it was probably him. That judgment wasn't irrational. It just didn't account for what was about to happen to the economy. But before the economy collapsed, there was Memphis. In October 2006, Laettner and Davis announced something that captured every sports page in the country. They were attempting to purchase 70% of the Memphis Grizzlies. The price? Hundreds of millions of dollars. The plan? Laettner would return to professional basketball as both owner and player. To help finance the bid, they turned to someone who trusted Laettner completely, Scottie Pippen. The same Scottie Pippen who had stood beside Laettner at the 1992 Barcelona Olympics, who had been his teammate on the greatest basketball team ever assembled. Pippen invested. Others invested. The group believed in the vision. The deal collapsed. Insufficient funding. The bid fell apart before it ever reached the finish line. And when it did, Pippen's money, along with the money of others, didn't come back. This was not a small problem. This was Scottie Pippen, a Hall of Famer, a man who had trusted Laettner not as a financial stranger, but as someone he'd shared a locker room with, a gold medal podium with, a chapter of basketball history with. Pippen sued. The lawsuit sought $30 million. A judge eventually ruled that Laettner and Davis owed Pippen $2.55 million. At that point, a reasonable person might have stopped, reassessed, pulled back. Laettner did not stop. He still had the Durham project. He still had the vision. He still had the absolute, unshakable belief, the same belief that had carried him from a janitor's closet in Buffalo to the dream team, that if he just competed hard enough, and long enough, he would find a way to win. What he couldn't see yet was that the game had fundamentally changed, and nobody around him was willing to tell him. Let's be precise about something before we go further. Because when this story gets told in courtrooms, in newspaper headlines, in the kind of sports media that reduces complex financial disasters to simple moral verdicts, it tends to get told one of two ways. Either Laettner was a con man, deliberately defrauding trusting athletes out of their savings, or he was simply reckless, a jock who thought he could play businessman and got humiliated by the real world. Both versions are wrong. What actually happened was more complicated, and in some ways, more damning than either narrative. What happened was a man who genuinely believed in what he was building, who kept raising money against assets that were real but illiquid, who expanded into markets he didn't understand without the infrastructure to manage them, and who, when the entire architecture began to shake, responded the only way he knew how, by pushing harder. The lawsuits didn't arrive all at once. They came in a sequence. One, then another, then another, like cracks spreading across a wall that everyone could see, but nobody wanted to call structural. The first major signal came from Sean Merriman. Merriman was an NFL linebacker, a four-time Pro Bowler at his peak. He had invested in Laettner and Davis's real estate operations, not as a passive stranger, but as someone who believed in the people behind the project. The investment went bad. The money didn't come back. Merriman took it to federal court. A judge ruled that Laettner and Davis owed him $3.7 million. At the time, this was reported as a setback, a bad deal. The kind of thing that happens in real estate when timing goes wrong. What it actually was in retrospect was a warning flare. Then came Johnny Dawkins. This one is harder to explain away, because Dawkins wasn't just any investor. He was a former Duke captain, a man who had played in the same program under the same coach, who had watched Laettner become a legend from the inside. In November 2006, his company, J.D. Holdings, loaned Blue Devil Ventures $500,000 to develop property in Baltimore. The Baltimore project failed. The money wasn't repaid. Dawkins sued. A judge ordered Laettner, Davis, and their company to pay Dawkins $671,309. What happened next is almost too painful to write without pausing. Laettner and Davis certified to the court that they did not have the ability to pay the judgment. Their proposed payment schedule to their former Duke teammate, the man who had trusted them specifically because of their shared history, was $1,500 per month. At that rate, it would take nearly 37 years to settle a debt. Johnny Dawkins, former Duke captain, former assistant coach, head coach at Stanford, waiting 37 years to be paid back by the men he called teammates. By this point, a pattern had emerged that the courts could see clearly, even if Laettner couldn't. Blue Devil Ventures had overextended. After the success of West Village Phase 1, Laettner and Davis had, without Neiman's steadying presence, attempted to replicate the Durham model in Baltimore and Philadelphia. Different cities, different markets, different political landscapes, different everything. It didn't work. The projects in those cities stalled, then collapsed. Investors who had committed money based on the Durham success story found themselves holding nothing. And here is the critical distinction that separates this from a deliberate fraud. There is no evidence in any court filing, any investigation, or any reporting that Laettner and Davis set out to steal from anyone. What the evidence shows, consistently, is something subtler and ultimately more destructive. They took on more than they could manage. They raised capital against a vision that was real in Durham, but never translated elsewhere. They kept going when stopping would have been wiser, and they surrounded themselves with people, investors, partners, fellow athletes whose trust made it easier to keep going rather than harder. When everyone around you believes in you, it is very difficult to tell yourself to stop. Then 2008 arrived and took the decision out of everyone's hands. The financial crisis didn't just hurt Blue Devil Ventures, it paralyzed the entire commercial real estate sector. Construction froze, credit dried up. The $160 million West Village Phase 2 project, already struggling, effectively stopped. The 7 buildings Laettner and Davis had purchased in 2005 sat waiting for capital that was no longer available. According to reports from that period, multiple outlets noted the project had stalled indefinitely, though the full extent of the financial damage only became clear in subsequent court filings. What is confirmed through Laettner's own attorney's statements to the court in 2010. At that moment, Christian Laettner had $10 million in assets and $40 million in debt. Let that settle for a moment. $61.5 million earned in the NBA, a real estate company that had genuinely transformed a city, a name that had opened doors and attracted investment from professional athletes across 2 sports, and $40 million in debt. The Pippen lawsuit, the Merriman judgment, the Dawkins payment plan, the stalled Philadelphia and Baltimore projects, the frozen Durham Phase 2. The creditors multiplying while the assets sat illiquid, waiting for a market that kept refusing to recover. By any rational assessment, this was the moment to stop fighting and start surrendering. To file for bankruptcy, restructure, accept the loss, and protect what remained. But Christian Laettner had spent his entire life being told he didn't belong and winning anyway. He was not going to stop now. And that decision, more than any bad investment or failed city project, is what set up everything that came next. Because what came next wasn't a market problem or a recession problem. It was a decision. A deliberate, calculated, legally consequential decision, made by a man who had run out of options and chose the one that would cost everyone around him the most. Act 4. Suing your own company. To understand what happened next, you need to understand the structure of Blue Devil Ventures. It wasn't one company. It was a web of interconnected entities: Blue Devil Ventures, BDV3, Fuller Street Developments, and others, each created for specific phases of specific projects, each with its own investors, its own promissory notes, its own obligations. This kind of structure is common in real estate development. It's designed to compartmentalize risk, to protect one project from the failures of another. In Laettner's case, it created something else entirely. It created a maze. And in 2011, when the walls were closing in from every direction, Laettner and Davis found a door inside that maze that nobody else could see. Or at least, nobody else was supposed to see it until it was too late. By 2011, West Village Phase 1, the original project, the one that had actually worked, was the last real asset left. Phase 2 was frozen. Baltimore was gone. Philadelphia was gone. The Grizzlies bid was a memory and a judgment. The creditors were multiplying, and the men who had built West Village were quietly beginning to sell it off, piece by piece, to whoever would buy. This is when Tom Neiman, the third founder, the Duke Business School graduate who had been there from the beginning, found himself in an uncomfortable position. Neiman had been the operational spine of Blue Devil Ventures from the start. Where Laettner and Davis brought the name and the vision, Neiman brought the competence, the knowledge of tax credits, HUD financing, municipal relationships, the unglamorous machinery that makes a development project actually work. West Village Phase 1 succeeded, in no small part, because Neiman knew what he was doing. He had also, according to subsequent court filings, watched the Phase 2 ambitions expand well beyond what the underlying financials could support. He had concerns. He raised them. Then, in 2012, he was removed. Davis, Laettner, and the partner named Britton voted to remove Neiman as manager of BDV3, the entity controlling Phase 2. The vote was legal. The structure allowed it. Neiman was out. What happened immediately afterward is where this story crosses a line that no business school case study would recommend. With Neiman gone, and with Davis, Laettner, and Britton now in control of BDV3, Laettner and Britton did something that their own former partner would later describe in court documents as self-dealing and collusion. They sued BDV3, their own company, the company they had just taken full control of. Laettner filed a lawsuit claiming BDV3 owed him money on loans he had previously made to the entity. Britton filed a similar claim. And here is the detail that makes the whole structure collapse into something much darker than bad business judgment. Davis, BDV3's manager, Laettner's closest friend since Duke. The man who had shared a dormitory room with him, built a company with him, stood beside him through every previous disaster, chose not to oppose the lawsuits. BDV3, under Davis's management, did not fight back. A company that had legitimate assets, a $6.5 million promissory note, and an $11.8 million promissory note from affiliate entities, simply declined to defend itself against the men who controlled it from the outside while managing it from the inside. The court entered judgment in Laettner's favor, $10 million. Britton received $1.5 million. And according to Neiman Capital's subsequent lawsuit, the practical effect of those judgments was to do exactly one thing: wipe out any realistic chance that the other investors, the people who had put real money into BDV3, expecting real returns, would ever see a dollar back. What is confirmed through court documents filed by Neiman Capital in Durham County Superior Court. The lawsuit alleged that the promissory note Davis executed on behalf of BDV III, the so-called Laettner note, valued at $9 million, had no record of BDV III ever actually receiving it, meaning the debt the lawsuit was based on may not have reflected a real obligation at all. The lawsuit alleged that the judgments were entered into as a result of collusion of interested managers and Davis, who has extensive personal ties with Laettner since they played together on Duke University's varsity basketball team. The lawsuit alleged that the Laettner and Britton judgments do not reflect an actual debt owed by BDV3. What the documents never specified, and what remains unresolved in the public record, is precisely how much Laettner personally directed versus how much emerged from a structure that had been allowed through neglect, desperation, or design to collapse inward on itself. But here is what cannot be disputed. The investors lost their capital. Neiman, the man who had built the operational foundation of West Village, lost his position and his return. And Laettner walked out with a $10 million judgment from a company he had helped create, populated with investors he had personally recruited, managed by a man who had been his best friend since college. The outside world was catching up fast. In 2015, the house in Ponte Vedra Beach, Florida, a $4 million property outside Jacksonville, where Laettner had been living with his wife and 3 children, was foreclosed on. Not sold under pressure. Not sold at a loss. Foreclosed. The man who had earned $61.5 million playing basketball, who had built a company that transformed a city, who had stood on an Olympic podium with the greatest players who ever lived, lost his house to a bank. Shortly after, his wife filed for divorce. And then came 2016. 5 creditors. 5 separate lawsuits that had been grinding through courts in North Carolina, Florida, and Maryland for years. 5 groups of people who had trusted Laettner with their money and received nothing back but legal fees and broken promises. They had had enough. In June 2016, those 5 creditors filed papers to force Christian Laettner into involuntary Chapter 7 bankruptcy, the most severe form, the one where a trustee liquidates your assets and distributes them to whoever you owe, in whatever order the court decides. The list of what they were owed. NSA-SP number 3, LLC, $7. $32 million. Jonathan Stewart, Carolina Panthers running back, $3.62 million. D&F DCU, $1.38 million. Ernest Sims, former NFL linebacker, $1.48 million. Park Lane IBS, LLC, $236,192. Total, over $14 million. These weren't Wall Street institutions. Stewart was an NFL running back who had trusted a former athlete with money he had earned playing a sport that destroys your body before you turn 40. Sims was a linebacker who believed in a vision that had once been real. They weren't wrong to believe in it. That's what makes this so difficult to reduce to a simple verdict. West Village existed. It worked. It was real. The vision that Laettner had sold them was not fiction. It was a genuine development that would eventually sell for $187 million. They just never saw a dollar of it. The morning the bankruptcy filing made the news, ESPN ran it alongside his career highlights. The same footage they always used. Grant Hill's pass arcing across the court, Laettner catching it, the dribble, the turn, the shot. Perfect form, perfect execution, not a single wasted movement. The same man, the same absolute certainty that he would find a way to win. Except this time, the clock had already hit 0, and the people standing on the wrong end of it weren't Kentucky fans. They were his teammates. February 2016. While the bankruptcy proceedings were still months away, something happened in Durham that almost nobody connected to Laettner's story at the time. West Village sold. Not for the $160 million that Laettner and Davis had originally dreamed about in 2005. Not under their ownership. Not with their names on the deed. The company that had purchased the project from Blue Devil Ventures, after years of Laettner and Davis selling off pieces to survive, closed a deal with an Ohio-based real estate firm. The final sale price? $187 million. The commercial spaces were at 100% occupancy. The residential units were running at roughly 95% year-round. The abandoned tobacco warehouses that nobody wanted in the mid-1990s. The buildings that Laettner and Davis had looked at and seen something everyone else missed. They had become exactly what the vision promised. A thriving, self-sustaining urban neighborhood in the heart of Durham, worth $187 million, with someone else's name on the paperwork. Laettner's share of the proceeds through his remaining interest in Fuller Street Developments, one of the successor entities, came to approximately $10 million. On the surface, that sounds like a lifeline. And it was. Just not in the way anyone would have chosen. That $10 million didn't go into a bank account. It didn't pay off a mortgage or fund a comfortable transition into whatever came next. It went directly into negotiations with the 5 creditors who were trying to force him into bankruptcy. His attorney, Hassan Zavari, filed a motion in U.S. bankruptcy court to dismiss the involuntary proceedings, arguing that the West Village proceeds could be used to reach a settlement with everyone Laettner owed. In October 2016, a hearing was held in Durham. The involuntary bankruptcy was dismissed. Christian Laettner, technically, avoided Chapter 7. But let's sit with the arithmetic of that outcome for a moment. Because the numbers tell a story that the legal resolution doesn't. A project conceived in 1995. 21 years of development, litigation, expansion, failure, recession, restructuring, and loss. The project that cost Laettner his marriage, his house, his relationships with teammates and investors, and partners who had trusted him with real money. The project that generated lawsuits from Scottie Pippen, Johnny Dawkins, Sean Merriman, Jonathan Stewart, Ernest Sims, and a roster of others whose names appeared in court filings across 3 states. That project sold for $187 million. Laettner received $10 million and handed most of it to creditors. The people who had purchased West Village from him, who had finished what he started, who had brought it to full occupancy and sold it at the peak of Durham's real estate renaissance, they made a fortune on a vision that was never theirs. This is not a metaphor. It is a precise description of what happened. The man who saw the abandoned warehouses when nobody else did, who convinced investors to believe in a city that didn't believe in itself yet, who spent 2 decades fighting to make something real out of nothing, watched someone else sell it for $187 million and walked away with just enough to avoid the bankruptcy court. What doesn't appear in any settlement document is the cost that can't be quantified. Johnny Dawkins, former Duke captain, a man who had watched Laettner become a legend from the inside of the same locker room, who had lent money not to a stranger but to a teammate, spent years waiting to be repaid, was offered $1,500 a month and had to take it to a federal judge to get resolution. Scottie Pippen, Olympic teammate, gold medalist, a man whose own financial history was complicated enough. He had been famously underpaid throughout his career with the Bulls, invested in Laettner's vision, and had to sue to recover $2.55 million. Jonathan Stewart, an NFL running back who put in $3.62 million. A man who earned that money absorbing hits from 300-pound defensive linemen who trusted it to someone whose name he recognized from sports history. These weren't casualties of a market crash or a fraud scheme. They were casualties of misplaced faith, which is, in some ways, the worst kind. Today, West Village stands exactly where Laettner imagined it in 1995. The old tobacco warehouses converted into restaurants, apartments, offices, the kind of urban space that wins architecture awards and gets featured in city planning case studies. Durham's downtown revival, which West Village anchored, is considered one of the more successful urban regeneration stories in the American South. Laettner's name does not appear on the building. He runs youth basketball camps. He has spoken occasionally about the real estate years with the kind of measured, post-catastrophe reflection that only comes from a man who has genuinely processed what went wrong. He is 56 years old. The gold medal is still real. The 2 championship banners at Duke are still real. The shot is still the shot. But the thing he spent the 20 years after basketball trying to build the second act, the proof that he was more than a basketball player, slipped through his hands in a Durham courtroom while someone else collected the check. There's a particular kind of loss that doesn't have a clean name. It's not failure, exactly. The vision was right. The project worked. It's something closer to building a door, losing the key, and watching someone else walk through it. So what actually collapsed here? Not the buildings. West Village is still standing, still full, still exactly what Laettner said it would be in 1995 when nobody believed him. What collapsed was the assumption that the qualities which make someone exceptional in one arena will transfer cleanly into another. At Duke, the refusal to stop was a superpower. You don't hit that shot against Kentucky if some part of you is capable of accepting defeat. You don't make the dream team. You don't survive Jordan's practices. You don't win 2 championships. None of it happens without a mentality that treats surrender as simply not an option. That same mentality, applied to a real estate empire with other people's money, becomes something else entirely. It becomes the reason you don't stop after Memphis. The reason you don't stop after Merriman. The reason you don't stop after Dawkins, after Pippen, after the $40 million in debt in 2010. The reason you eventually end up in a room where the only move left is to sue the company you built, managed by the friend you trusted most, funded by people who believed in you, and call it a legal strategy. Christian Laettner was never stupid. He was never malicious. He was exactly what he had always been, a man constitutionally incapable of believing that he wouldn't find a way to win. In basketball, that's a gift. In the real world, it's a liability that compounds interest. He grew up mopping floors to stay in a school where he didn't belong. He spent his whole life proving he deserved to be in rooms that told him he didn't. The tragedy isn't that he lost. The tragedy is that he never learned there were rooms where the right move was to walk away.